The 2001 Anthrax Attacks was one of the most difficult, biggest, and complex cases the FBI has ever dealt with, shaking the organization to its very core. This involved multiple media outlets, politicians, and the loss of lives. So let's go above the brain and find out what makes this case so deadly interesting. When two Boeing 767s was hijacked by Al-Qaeda terrorists while passengers was on board. Hours later, they flew into the Twin Towers, located in Lower Manhattan, New York. In under 2 hours, both 110-story buildings collapsed in the rubble, and causing the death of close to 3,000 lives. And the New York Times estimates the total cost of the attack to the U.S. was $3.3 trillion in damages. About 7 days after the attacks on the World Trade Center, strange letters start to arrive at media outlet addresses and congressional office through USPS from Trenton, New Jersey. But naturally, most of the media companies like the New York Post, the National Enquiry, NBC, CBS, and ABC ignored these letters until early morning of October 2nd, 2001. A confused and discoherent Robert Stevens, a photographer from The Sun, walked into the emergency department of JFK Medical Center in Palm Beach, Florida, shortly after returning home from a vacation trip to North Carolina. The infectious disease doctor thought the 62-year-old could be suffering from a case of meningitis. But after interviewing his wife, standing at his bedside, and doing extensive laboratory work to inspect a gram-strain sample of his spinal fluid, Robert was later diagnosed with anthrax. A day later, Stephen dies from complications from the bacteria. It's the first anthrax death in the last 25 years in the United States. 3 days later, tests were later ran on his computer keyboard that also tested positive for anthrax. And there, it all started. The case that would baffle and confuse the Federal Bureau of Investigations for close to a decade and force the FBI to create the Anthrax Task Force. The task force will consist of roughly 25 to 30 full-time investigators from the Federal Bureau of Investigations, the U.S. Postal Inspection Service, and also other law enforcement agencies, like the Justice Department's Counterterrorism Section, and federal prosecutors from the District of Columbia, and expended hundreds of thousands of investigator work hours on this case. Their efforts involved more than 10,000 witness interviews on 6 different continents, the execution of 80 searches, and recovery of more than 6,000 items for potential evidence during the course of this investigation. The case involved the issuance of more than 5,750 grand jury subpoenas and the collection of 5,730 environmental samples from 60 site locations. In addition, the new scientific methods that were developed ultimately to lead to the break in this case. These methods had far-reaching impacts on future investigations. These are confirmed facts straight from the FBI website. Here is a timeline of the chain events that occurred during the anthrax attacks. The 7-month son of an ABC News freelancer producer tests positive for anthrax poisoning. The baby developed a rash soon after visiting the New York Times Manhattan offices on September 28th. 2 postal employees at a post office in D.C. die of anthrax exposure. An employee of the Manhattan Eye, Ear, and Throat Hospital dies from inhaling anthrax. President George W. Bush says the anthrax letters represents another terrorist attack on the United States, and he would be requesting $11 billion over the next 2 years to further protect the United States from bio-terrorism. A 94-year-old woman of Connecticut became the 5th person to die from inhaling anthrax. She was the last victim of the bio attacks. And, for some strange reason, all of the anthrax attacks stopped in 2001, with no solid suspect in line. In mid-2002, the investigations finally had a viable suspect.
I want to look my fellow Americans directly in the eye and declare to them, I am not the anthrax killer.
Dr. Stephen Hatfill, a successful scientist who worked in the U.S. Army's Medical Research Institute of Infectious Disease years back at Fort Detrick, Maryland, which kept stocks of anthrax on deck. And due to public pressure by the media and American citizens, the FBI tried investigating as much information as they could and followed every lead. So, they talked to a variety of experts, and one was Don Foster, an American professor and also was an excellent textual analyzer, author, literature detective, and consulted the FBI on the Unabomber case years back. So, it's no surprise that the FBI would ask for its opinion on the case. So they contacted the English professor to examine some documents in the difficult anthrax investigation. Foster started examining letters the FBI sent him, and then did investigational homework himself. Foster says he became interested in virologist Stephen Hatfill. Foster conceded in the Vanity Fair that when the FBI first approached him, he was perfectly willing to believe that anthrax was garden variety, that it has been sent by the Muslim extremists. But he changed his mind. He writes after plotting Hatfill's travels to the next delivery date of several suspicious hoax letters, and after reading old interviews of Hatfill in which he warned how easy it would be to carry out a biological attack, and after reviewing Hatfill's unpublished novel Emergence, the novel, Foster writes, revolves around an Iraqi virologist who launches a bio-terror attack on the United States. It also happens that Hatfill was familiar with anthrax. He then discovered that Hatfill had been in Zimbabwe during an anthrax outbreak known to occur among livestock in the 1970s. So it was obvious that he had a pretty solid knowledge on anthrax poisoning. In June, the FBI asked to swap and search his apartment. Hatfill agreed, feeling he'd had nothing to hide. On June 25, 2002, he came home to find reporters and camera crews swarming his home. So the FBI was very confident that they had the right guy. Hatfill retaliated by filing a suit against Donald Foster for his interview in Vanity Fair in October 2003. He also, in that year, he filed another lawsuit against the Justice Department for leaking information about him and his personal life, violating the privacy policy. By early 2007, after refreshing their investigation and re-examining evidence collected in the anthrax case, he never had access to the anthrax at the Army Medical Research Institution of Infectious Disease. In late June 2008, the Justice Department settled with him, and he was rewarded with $4.6 million in cold, hard cash. So then, the FBI had no suspect for this difficult case. Then it happened. After extremely long hours of scientific research, they found critical evidence on accident. Early on in the investigation, a researcher unintentionally let samples used in the mailing sit longer than expected. These samples showed a lot of unusual physical characteristics that pointed researchers to a positive genetic mutation identifying signatures. Without the accidental discovery, the anthrax might not have been able to home in a unique signature that led them to the RMR 1029 Flask in Ivin's laboratory. Given Ivin's research at the U.S. Military Medical Research Institution of Infectious Disease, Ivin had access to the flask. The envelope used in attacks also sourced to several locations and are relatively near Ivin's Maryland home. But this scientific evidence did not point to Ivin alone. Others working in the same laboratory had access to the same flask, and Ivin had shared samples of spores with researchers at other laboratories. And this was not the FBI's only evidence against Ivin. During the height of the Anthrax attacks, Ivin was working in the laboratory extremely late into the night, and failed to give investigators a reason why he was so active during those hours. Ivin also worked for a company that was supposed to come up with a vaccine for anthrax for the US Army, but lost the FDA approval to actually do so. So all of this evidence obviously raised eyebrows to everyone and anyone involved in this case. So investigators spoke to Ivin and his lawyers with damning evidence against him. Later on, in 2008, July 29th, he took his own life by overdosing on Tylenol. His suicide drove conspiracy theorists crazy and wasn't a good look for the FBI at all because of Hatfill's situation. And some thought he was innocent. It was under brutal pressure and stalked by the FBI like Hatfill was, and cracked severely under pressure of the investigation. Sadly, no one in this case was ever charged with the death of 5 innocent citizens and 17 sickened by the Anthrax attacks. I've learned from making this video what makes bioterrorism so scary is that you can't see it. It makes something as harmless as paper terrifying and deadly.